You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 28th of October, 2024, on Monocle Radio.
Protests against the result of Georgia's parliamentary election, led by Georgia's own president. A dishearteningly symbolic decision by one of Germany's best-known brands. And does anybody really vote the way a newspaper tells them to? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Patricia Cohen and Quentin Peel will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the Pulitzer-winning New York Times reporters Suzanne Craig and Russ Buettner about their new biography of Donald Trump, the serially unsuccessful businessman. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Patricia Cohen, Global Economics Correspondent at the New York Times, and by Quentin Peel, regular Monocle Radio contributor. Hello to you both.
Hello there.
Greetings.
I don't know where to start with your serial gallivantings, both of you, but Quentin, you are about to gallivant to the south of France, which... I mean, this is the right time of year to do it when this country has just once again pointlessly condemned itself to another 6 months of gruesome darkness.
Indeed it is, and I'm going to behave very well, I hope, and not fly down there. I'm going to take the train, which will go quite quickly as long as it's the TGV on the other side of the channel. Unfortunately, on the way back, they appear to have engineering works, and I'm going to have come back rather slowly.
Oh, never mind. But still, it's more time that you're not spending in gloomy, darkened Britain, and again, I made this pledge before, I will make it again, the first act of my revolutionary government, was the word I was grasping for, will be permanent, Patricia Cohen, year-round GMT +2. But you have recently been in Spain, where it was presumably a bit sunny?
It was very sunny there, and I was in Madrid, which I hadn't been to in at least 25 years, and I was just really struck by how prosperous the city looks, and it was really bustling. And, Spain at the moment is actually doing better than most other EU countries, and you could really see it.
Well, we will have more from both of you shortly, but we will be starting in Georgia, where possibly for the first of two times in the next week or so, a jurisdiction of that name is hosting a considerable hubbub over the legitimacy of an election result. In Saturday's parliamentary election in Georgia, the country, the ruling Georgian Dream party claimed victory, winning one fewer seat than last time, but still holding a handy majority of 89 of the 150 seats in Georgia's parliament. However, among what seems a sizable cohort of Georgians who appear unconvinced is Georgia's president, Salome Zurabichvili, who has declared the whole thing a fix and called for protests. And we're joined now from Tbilisi by Nino Gash, a senior editor with Radio Free Europe's Georgian service. Nino, first of all, photographs and film and social media suggests that there is quite a crowd on Rustaveli Avenue, the main street in Tbilisi. What sense do you get of the scale of this?
Oh yeah, it's hello. First of all, everybody, thank you for your interest. Actually, I'm just back from that protest rally, which was organized in the center of Tbilisi, in front of the Parliament building, and one of the first main speaker was the president of Georgia, Salome Zurabichvili, and she was followed later by the opposition leaders and also activists. As for the scale of the rally, it was quite a crowded and quite a dense gathering of people. I cannot judge now about numbers because I was inside it. I haven't seen yet because it has just finished several minutes ago. I haven't seen the pictures from above or from radar to judge about the number of people, but people were standing there who were protesting also the results of these elections. And at this rally, the opposition leaders declared that they have a plan, and their request is to organize. They said they are not going to enter the parliament, and they are requesting another elections in Georgia to be organized in a different way, to be organized and administered not by the local Central Election Commission, but they, quote, they said international election administration. To be frank, I'm not sure what does it mean exactly. It was not explained in details. And meanwhile, the monitoring of election observer missions, local ones, continue doing their job of gathering and preparing evidences of numerous thousands of fraud cases and rigging cases at the polling stations. And it's very important to gather all those to make a whole picture of the scale of rigging the elections and also how it might affect the results, the real results of the elections. To be frank, nobody knows now in details what is going to happen in next days and next weeks concerning these elections. The fact is that the opposition part is not going to enter the parliament, and they are protesting against the results.
Nino, for all that, as you correctly point out, we don't know what's going to happen in coming days and weeks, but does it strike you that the government, or the re-elected government, as it claims to be, is hoping that the protesters will just go home and give up and that they can ride this out?
That's how does it seem now at the moment. That's how does it seem now at the moment. And the government also is now busy with hosting Hungarian leader Viktor Orban. You know, he arrived this evening in Tbilisi, and as it is known, he resides at one of the hotels in Tbilisi, actually at the place which is where the rally was going on. And at the same place, as I know, today, ambassadors of the Western countries, including the U.S. ambassador, were holding meeting with the opposition leaders. So some kind of very active process, very tough process is going on, but the result and the content of it is not revealed yet.
Nino Gash in Tbilisi, thank you very much for joining us. We'll bring our panel back in now, Patricia Cohen and Quentin Peel. Quentin, first of all, does this start to seem a little bit like a sort of a rerun of Ukraine? We have the country pulled between Russia and Europe. We have a hefty cohort of the population, at least, who seem pretty convinced that their government is conspiring against them.
Yeah, I think exactly that, and indeed there is a track record too in Georgia itself. Mm-hmm. Remember the Rose Revolution in Georgia, and then the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And what really sparked these revolts were rigged elections, basically, where a clear portion of the population, almost certainly a majority of the population in Ukraine, or certainly in Kiev in Ukraine, rose up and said, we're not having any of this. And Tbilisi is a bit the same, because the Tbilisi population is overwhelmingly, I think, very passionate about we want to join the European Union, and unhappy with a government that seems to be to some degree, at least, in a marriage of convenience with the powers of Moscow, with Mr. Putin, and actually introducing laws that look rather similar to Russian laws.
But, Patricia, that's often it right there, isn't it? That it may well be the case that a hefty percentage of the population of the big cosmopolitan capital city feel more oriented towards the West and towards Europe, but it's often the case that that sentiment is not echoed in the country. We see this all over the world, and we also see, I think, media coverage which tends to orient towards the big cities, because that's also where the reporters are.
I mean, just what I've read, and I don't know how kind of legitimate or valid these polls are, but as I understand it, many of the rural voters, who also tend to skew older and are more conservative, particularly on a social agenda as well, tend to support the ruling party that won, while younger urban voters tend to go for the opposition. Remember, older voters, if they speak Russian, as opposed to the younger voters who, if they have a second language, it's now usually English. And so there is a very different orientation, and as well as, I think, a nostalgia perhaps for some of the stability that the region had during the Soviet era, even though it was deprived of freedom.
Do you get the sense here, though, Quentin, that the opposition parties and indeed the president are trying to force some sort of showdown? As Nino was just telling us, the opposition parties have said they won't sit in the new parliament, which is always an interesting balance in itself as a decision, because on the one hand, you're basically just giving the run of things up to the government. But I guess if their worries, if they do take their seats in the parliament, it looks like they've accepted the result of this election.
Yeah, and I think that the opposition parties, who clearly, I think, did expect to do considerably better than they have done, and their polling seemed to suggest that they were, going to win. And after all, the Georgian Dream party has been in power for a long time now. I think they want to bring things to a head. But I think it is a risk, and the risk is that there is, tell you what Patricia was talking about earlier, the more conservative rural population, but also a significant portion of the population who I think felt this was a choice between the European Union, which they see without any doubt is their long-term aim, and living with Moscow, which is what they've got to do in the short term. And I think that they think back to 2008, when there was a war with Russia, and the Russians came in and they grabbed 2 chunks of land out of Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and they've never been Georgia since. They've been essentially controlled by Russian surrogates. And people, therefore, don't want to infuriate the Russians at this time. So I think there's a real tension there between the underlying passion, which is pro-European, we want to be in the EU. 30 years ago, I was there, and people talked about having a Georgian dream, and that was joining the European Union. They really wanted it.
Patricia, just finally on this, and something else Nino mentioned, Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, has got on a plane to fly to Tbilisi to congratulate, the new government as he sees it. There's been an amount of harumphing about this by his fellow EU leaders who wish to make it clear that he does not speak to them, or speak for them, rather. But what is he actually... I know it's a question you can ask rhetorically about Viktor Orban all the time, but what does he think he's doing here?
I think he's reaching out and supporting other authoritarian leaders, and I think he would be happy in some ways, even though he also is leaned towards Moscow, if there were more leaders like him who joined the EU and, reduced Brussels' power and let it act more like a confederation, so that they manage to get the economic benefits and the aid that EU provides, but stay out of all other kind of political and foreign policy decisions.
Well, to Germany now, and one of those developments which may not be a massive whoop, grand scheme of things, but has the sort of symbolic resonance which makes already unpopular governments extremely nervous. Volkswagen, for the first time in its 87-year history, is going to close production plants in Germany. At least 3 will be shuttered entirely and others will be downsized. While there are, of course, aspects of Volkswagen's early years which neither country nor company care to be reminded of, the brand has become synonymous with the reputation for reliability on which modern Germany has traded. Quentin, first of all, I'll ask that question. Grand scheme of things, is this actually a massive whoop?
I think it is pretty indicative of severe problems that the manufacturing industry faces in Germany, and above all the motor car industry. And they're caught in a sort of perfect storm. They're caught in a storm where their costs are too high, they've got far too many workers, they haven't moved fast enough into electronic vehicles, and their biggest single market, China, has gone really slow on them. So they're caught, and they're desperate to try and slim down, but they're also in that classic German position where the workers have 50% of the votes on the supervisory board, and the workers are absolutely livid that their livelihoods are going to be put on the line. So we could be facing, actually, one hell of a strike.
Well, indeed so. Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Patricia, was recently trying, I think, to be encouraging or reassuring. He said that German car makers should not fear China. He said German car makers have, of course, previously seen off the challenges from Japan and South Korea. But was he in danger there of starting to sound not so much reassuring as complacent?
I don't think anybody is complacent, particularly in Germany, about the competition from the Chinese in the car industry. And what you've seen the Chinese do is move to open up more plants within Europe as a way of avoiding the tariffs, which are set to, there were new tariffs just voted on, and they're set to take effect at the end of this month on EVs coming from China, and they can go as high as 45%. And the reality is that, none of these countries can compete with the Chinese industry. They pay their workers much less, costs are much lower. China has cutting-edge technology that the West has not caught up to yet. And so it's a real dilemma. And I agree it is a big whoop, because the car industry is the biggest industry in Germany, and we're talking about tens of thousands of jobs that will be affected. And it's not simply that there are too many workers, is that they're higher paid workers. And so you're really getting at this issue, which is, the impact of globalization everywhere that you see all through Europe and in the U.S., which is, industry moving to countries with cheaper labor costs, and industries at home simply cannot compete.
Is the nightmare scenario for German car manufacturers, Quentin, not so much the prospect that German people will want to buy Chinese cars instead of German cars, but that Chinese people will start wanting to buy Chinese cars instead of German cars? Because you can see, or it's imaginable, certainly, that China is on the same trajectory as Japan, because there was a point at which Japanese cars were a punchline. Everybody laughed at them, and they got better and better and better and better until they became absolute benchmarks for rock-solid reliability. If the same thing starts to happen with Chinese cars, that Chinese market's been huge for Germany, hasn't it?
Absolutely, yes. Something like a third of their profits come from China, so that's big. But they are. I mean, Volkswagen is huge. They produce well over 9 million vehicles, but their problem is that Toyota, that produces just under 9 million vehicles a year, actually does it with 370,000 workers, whereas Volkswagen has about 800,000 workers. So you see the huge difference. So you've got markets like Brazil, like Mexico. These are all big markets for Volkswagen, and they've just been rather slow to move with the new technology.
Just finally on this one, Patricia, extraordinary statistic, given that we have got so used over the last few decades to just assuming that the German economy will be the thing that holds the rest of Europe up. Its GDP is actually on course to shrink for the second year running. Now, I appreciate there's probably no short answer to the question, why is that? But is there a basically overarching answer for this, or is Germany just in one of those weird lulls that occasionally becomes a great nation?
No, I don't think so. I think there are actually structural changes that are happening not only in Germany, but all over the world that have followed on the heels of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And the biggest one for Germany, of course, has been the end of what was a long era of cheap gas from Russia. And the fact is that once the war in Ukraine broke out, that was an enormous competitive advantage for Germany and German industry that kind of evaporated overnight, and is not, even if the war were to end tomorrow, I think it's unlikely that, you're going to start the pipelines flowing. And so that's a change that is just a structural change, and cost of energy went up, and there's no more cheap gas. And so the whole world is going through this kind of energy transition that is changing costs.
Well, now to one of those semi-regular motifs of the Monocle Daily, in which we attempt to persuade a table full of journalists to overcome the trade's usual ironclad, heroically self-effacing reluctance to discuss the media at interminable self-indulgent length. At issue is the decision by two big US newspapers, the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post, to take a pass on endorsing a candidate in this year's presidential election, in which one of the contenders is a convicted criminal animated by morbid fantasies of becoming an American Franco, and put that way, it doesn't seem so difficult. Many now former subscribers and a good few employees suspect the proprietors of both newspapers of hedging against a possible Trump restoration. Patricia, first of all, your newspaper has endorsed in this election.
Yes.
I invite
vocally and repeatedly.
I invite listeners to take a wild guess as to which candidate the New York Times has picked. But why has the Times been different?
I mean, I think it basically has a lot to do with ownership. And, you've got...
because it does seem clear in both these cases that it was the owners who yanked the plug on the endorsement.
Yes, and the owner, I mean, it's always been the prerogative of an owner, any owner, corporate or individual, to, that's the tradition of running the editorial page and a decision on endorsements. A lot of owners, certainly that like the New York Times, take that with the advisement of, the professional staff, the editorial staff that they themselves have hired to do that and to evaluate and assess the candidates. But, the situation you have is two billionaires, essentially, one that owns the LA Times, one that owns the Washington Post, whose fortunes are very much going to be affected by a Trump administration if he is elected, that has already vowed to, take revenge on its opponents, and particularly in the media. And it's a very scary time for that, I have to say. So it does seem to me that particularly the way that this happened 11 days before the election, it wasn't, as if you had last year the owners saying, you know what, we're going to change our policy and not do endorsements anymore. But the timing and the way it was done does seem very much a kind of, fear. There's the New York Times has one of its slogan is "without fear or favor," and in this case, there definitely seems to be fear operating.
Does anybody want to try naming the last Republican the New York Times endorsed?
I know. I think they might have endorsed, for mayor, possibly Giuliani or Bloomberg.
But for president?
For president, I don't know.
It was actually, I was quite surprised by this, Eisenhower twice over Adlai Stevenson, who did just strike me, frankly, as the archetypal New York Times reader. But yes, fairly solid run of blues since then. Quentin, where are you on newspaper endorsements? Do they actually make any difference? Does anybody pick up their paper and thinking, well, I was going to vote for the other one, but now they've said, no, vote for this one, I'm voting for them instead?
I'd be amazed if they did, to be absolutely honest. I think this is pretty silly, and it's exaggerated to think that we newspapers have that much influence. Either our readers are already on the side that we're on, and therefore they don't need telling, or we are trying to be good, objective newspapers who analyse the policy and so on, but don't actually need to come out with an endorsement. Now, having said that, and said that I think it's actually rather foolish and arrogant of newspapers to think it makes a difference, I would say the timing of these particular decisions, which, as Patricia was saying, I mean, it's a nightmare. If they were going to do this, they should have done this not just before the election is about to take place, because it now sounds like they've taken sides.
Is there an argument, though, Patricia, that endorsements can actually be somewhat counterproductive? Because obviously someone like Donald Trump will make absolute hay with the fact that, the New York Times has endorsed his rival. What can you expect from that ivory tower of metropolitan elitist snobs, etc.? It's also... I cannot help but recall, given that The Guardian has also weighed in on this, The Guardian US, that their famous letter-writing campaign in 2004, which, and I believe the numbers confirm it, arguably actually won that election for George W. Bush over John Kerry. For listeners who may not recall, The Guardian identified a swing county in the swing state of Ohio, encouraged their listeners, or readers rather, to write to individual voters in Clark County, Ohio, to tell them why they shouldn't vote for George W. Bush. Bush won that county and won Ohio and won the White House. The Guardian, I do commend this to listeners, did rather sportingly print a few of the responses they received from Americans, which made certain references to the American Revolution and British dentistry and so forth. But Patricia, very long way of asking the question, can they actually go off in the newspaper's face?
I don't think so. I mean, funnily enough, my first job in journalism, which is now over 30 years ago, was on the editorial page of a newspaper, New York Newsday, that was once owned by the same family and company that owned the LA Times. And we used to joke back then even about how, endorsements don't really, newspaper endorsements don't change anything. Where I disagree with that, I think that actually endorsements can be quite influential in local elections and smaller elections where people don't know that much about the candidates. At this point, more, I think, any time, certainly in American history that I've lived through, the election is so polarized and there's so little exchange that I don't think anything is changing anybody's viewpoint at this moment in time.
On which subject, Quentin, we should just talk to yesterday's Trump rally in Madison Square Garden. There's a lot of wishful thinking, I think, at large in the non-Trump demographic that this might actually have changed some minds. The idea that after 9 years of being serially educated in exactly who and what Donald Trump is, people might now start to realise, oh my God, he's awful and he's surrounded by terrible weirdos.
Yeah, I think there was some stuff said there at the meeting which was horrendous. I mean, it was racist, it was angry, but this appeals, as we know, to Donald Trump's base. Having said that, there was very nasty things said about Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans, which could just have an effect in some quite key areas, talking about these local areas where there are Puerto Rican communities who might have been tempted to vote for Donald Trump, and now might feel a bit aggrieved. So it is possible. I mean, it's so close now that anything could tip it. And you wonder, maybe this is the October event we were waiting for.
It would seem somehow fitting if a hack warm-up comedian tipped Florida into the Democrat camp. But we should move along to India and to what must now be surely the world's most desirable rescue dog. Reading of the will of the late tycoon Ratan Tata, chair of the conglomerate of the same name, who died earlier this month, aged 86, has prompted an amount of bemusement, not least among the family who might have been anticipating a chunk of the 100 million quid he could not take with him. However, hefty quantities of the loot were instead bequeathed was the word I wanted, to his cook, his butler, and his dog. The lucky mutt is Tito, a German shepherd for whom unlimited care is mandated. Patricia, we do have to consider the possibility that a few chortling newspapers, and if we're honest, news programmes looking for an "and finally" story, have taken this out of context somewhat.
Well, I'm not sure that there is much more context to it, but let me offer maybe a novel view,
Go on.
Which is, on the one hand, I do think that there has been an evolution in thought about animals, and that, the kind of dominance and superiority of the human species has prevailed too much. And we, over time, society has become more cognizant of other animals, and, certainly in terms of brutality and work. And so the fact that, he's acknowledging the fact that the earth is shared with other species, I think, is kind of a wonderful thing. I don't know who gets to spend that money, though. Who gets to, is it a paw print on the check or what?
Exactly. There was a similar fracas occasioned, as you may remember, when the late Leona Helmsley left $12 million to her Maltese, whose name was Trouble. I think that was eventually scaled back when a few other actual people who thought they had a more pressing claim on her loot were able to get their solicitors on the case. But Quentin, I did like leaving a few bob to the staff. Does sound entirely admirable, doesn't it?
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. And I must say, if you look for the subtext, I suspect that Ratan Tata maybe wasn't terribly keen to leave loads of money to his siblings. Perhaps he didn't like them very much. It was certainly a very obvious gesture to say anybody but you sort of idea.
His siblings do have a lot of their own money, we should point out.
Yes, I don't think any members of the immediate Tata family are going to end up scratching about for a quid off the back of this. But I did want to close in closing. I wanted to close in closing by asking you both, do either of you plan to make any capricious bequests? I mean, obviously, hopefully many decades hence, but still.
I intend to spend every last cent before I go and enjoy it, so absolutely not.
Okay, well, that's glum tidings for Patricia's family there. Quentin, what about you?
Well, I like that. Patricia reminds me of that wonderful quote from Chuck Feeney, the billionaire, who said, "I want my last cheque to bounce," and gave all his money away before he died. So if we're still allowed after the budget this week in the UK to actually leave any money to anybody, maybe it would be best to give it away sooner.
Quentin Peel and Patricia Cohen, thank you for joining us. Finally, on today's show, it is 8 days until American voters decide whether or not it's worth taking the chance that an elderly career conman might grow into the office to which he aspires, despite the lack of evidence in favour of this proposition accumulated last time he was given a bash at it. While it may now feel like everything that could imaginably be written about Donald Trump has been written, a new book by Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporters Suzanne Craig and Russ Buettner is nevertheless worth reading, and not just because the title will annoy its subject. Lucky Loser: How Donald Trump Squandered His Father's Fortune and Created the Illusion of Success is a biography of Trump, the businessman. I spoke to Suzanne and Russ earlier and began by asking what, when they started work on the book, they felt like we still didn't know.
We had spent years looking at his finances and had done a number of stories at the paper. And what we really didn't feel was understood was the sweeping just nature of his life. So much has been written on the White House. There have been books written on his life before that, but we really felt that it needed the lens of him having been in the White House, and also two reporters to go back and kind of fact check a lot of what had been written in the 70s and 80s and 90s and just talk to as many people as we could. It was sort of actually an exciting prospect, just in that the books that we had read and the books that had come out had all been about his White House years. And we wanted to go back, we're investigative journalists, and sort of do a deep dive into the early years of both Donald and his father.
Russ, what Suzanne is being too modest to boast about there is that the pair of you won the Pulitzer Prize in 2019 for your investigations of Donald Trump's reporting. You very much have the receipts and you had presented them to the American public before. Is it a source of frustration to either of you that none of what you revealed and none of literally everything else we know about Donald Trump has proved entirely disqualifying?
I don't think it's a disappointment. I don't think we ever wake up in the morning and think we're going to do some work and it's going to create some specific outcome or even really think about outcomes. I think we're driven by trying to figure out things that are difficult and that seem interesting. And that's kind of the reward. It's in the figuring out and then figuring out how to tell it. And I think that's what this book was for us, was rewarding in that. Newspaper articles can only go so far. There's only so much space. And in this, we are able to kind of fill in all the blanks over the years and really reveal when the Donald Trump we saw in the White House became that Donald Trump. And telling that in a compelling way was the rewarding part of it for us.
Suzanne, you mentioned earlier going back and looking through various media claims made on his behalf or claims he had made to media. Do you feel like when you look back on the trajectory that the media deserves an amount of the blame for his rise for taking decades of his boasts at face value?
We do, and we go through that in the book. You know, we look at his rise in the 1970s and 80s. And I kind of talk about it in two parts because we see the young Donald Trump. He just started out working for Fred Trump. And he's talking to our newspaper, the New York Times, and he tells them he's worth $200 million. And he wasn't worth $200 million. I mean, his dad might have been, and he appropriated his father's wealth. And we see him continue to do that The number gets bigger and bigger through the 70s and 80s. And there's not a lot of fact checking going on that. We're looking at it through a lens now. He's become president, but at the time he was sort of seen as this bit of a character in New York, sort of a sideshow. He was running, and his father was a privately held company. It was very hard to get access to the information. So people kept repeating it, and it's frustrating to see it because it was successful. A lie passed down in history often becomes truth, and it did in this case. And it got to the point where serious news shows in the United States, like 60 Minutes, were calling him a billionaire, and he wasn't. And we chronicle that, and we also chronicle some of the dealings that he had with reporters where he claimed that he had sold all his stock before the crash, and he hadn't. We also go, though, through the book where we talk to a few journalists who speak truths about Donald Trump's finances. He certainly came after them, but there's a few characters in the book that are quite interesting, and they were the ones that took him on about his claims.
Russ, the book is meticulously sourced. You've spoken to dozens, hundreds, I think, of people who've known Donald Trump at various stages of his career. I'm curious about what impression they give of him as a person as opposed to a businessman, whether anybody you spoke to has any genuine affection for him despite everything. A phrase that definitely leapt off the pages was a member of the Apprentice production team saying our job was to reverse engineer the show and make him not look like a complete moron. It's an excellent question, Andrew. I feel like when people talk about Donald Trump, there's so much going on there, especially his mendacity. He just seems to need to lie about everything. So you do have to wonder, that's a good question when you think back in his life, who's liked what they've seen in him? And we did encounter people who are still in that sphere. I wouldn't say that there's a uniform view of the hundreds of people we've spoken to, but the people he has endeared himself, maybe too strong of a word, but who still think fondly of him, fall into a couple of categories. One, they sort of say that when he's talking to you, he can make you feel for a period of time like you're the only person in the room, and he's really interested in you. He can remember to ask about your kids and your spouse, and that resonates with people. If you cross him, that's over. But for as long as you're in that sort of realm, you've got that going for you. Also, that a lot of people who worked for him, there's definitely a trend where he hires people for jobs that are 2 steps above anything they've ever done before. Sometimes completely different than anything they've done before, and he just likes that person. And so he gives them the faith to do that, and he sort of lets them kind of do it. If they fail, he's brutal. It's all over. But people who do okay in that regard remember that fondly. They really appreciate that. It gave their career a big boost. A lot of them have left. They've gone on to bigger things, and that was a huge stepping stone for them. And that's the kind of thing that will, create good bond memories that last a long time. Just as a final thought, there is an awful lot to talk about that we could draw from this book, and I absolutely recommend listeners that they get hold of it because despite it being a book about business and real estate, it does turn out to be quite the rollicking read. But do you have any concerns that what you've inadvertently done possibly is actually divined his appeal to millions and millions of Americans, that this, barely educated, functionally illiterate, bone-idle buffoon can somehow blag his way to enormous wealth, colossal fame, and the most powerful office on earth? That's an interesting train of thought. I wouldn't have used all of those words myself, but I'm glad that you did, Andrew. I don't think so. I think when you look at his life in total, over the full sweep of it, that was part of the reason that we included his father. They were so different. And you see in Donald, from a very young age, all the things that you just so capably described. You see these trends where he's not paying attention to details, where he is increasingly over the course of his life disregarding people who are actually experts in the thing that he wants to do, where he increasingly throughout the course of his life believes the first thing that pops into his head, which is generally just the way he wants things to be, is the smartest analysis anyone could make. And that just becomes more calcified in him as he goes on. And as we revealed, causes more and more financial mistakes. And then I think that's really what you get when you see him in the White House. All of those kind of traits that have been escalating throughout the course of his life,
are now super magnified and in public view for the first time when he's in the White House. So I don't think we're building him up in telling that story.
That was Russ Buettner and Suzanne Craig. Their new book, Lucky Loser, How Donald Trump Squandered His Father's Fortune and Created the Illusion of Success, is available now and very, very much recommended. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Patty Cohen and Quentin Peel. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Sana Germani. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.